The Communist Party will rewrite the history of COVID-19, and it's not the first time they're doing so. Welcome to China Insider, I'm David Zhang. According to the Wall Street Journal, China is rewriting the history of what happened in the past 2 years. They're trying to reshape the way the pandemic is remembered in China, not by withholding data on its impact and censoring people who contradict the government line, but by touting the handling of the virus that was a triumphant victory. And honestly, this shouldn't surprise anyone. It's actually a typical way the Communist Party has handled history. They have on multiple occasions rewritten history. Before we go on further, please subscribe to our channel and like this video to help the video get reached to more audience, and also comment below what your thoughts are on today's video. Now, the most famous is actually how China fought in World War II. They claim that the Chinese Communist Party was the one that shed all the blood defending against Japan's invasion. But in reality, it was the Nationalist Party, the KMT, that did most of the work against the invading Japanese force. Meanwhile, what happened while the Nationalist Party was defending? The CCP, led by Mao Zedong, was in the countryside planting opium, selling it to make money, and so that they were preparing for a massive force for the upcoming civil war. And one of the biggest questions about COVID-19 is perhaps how many people died, which, again, we will never know the answer from the Communist Party. Of course, we have to talk about the origin of COVID, but the simple answer is we'll probably never know exactly where it came from the mouth of the Communist Party. But we also would very likely not know how many people actually died coming from the CCP. Of course, I can understand that one day, if the CCP falls, we will be able to uncover all the truth through things like what happened with the KGB files. We will be able to understand the real history of what happened. But for now, it's very likely that they've done enough to delete all of the information. Now, the origin is largely forgotten now, given the fact that China has tried everything to cover up where it comes from. And soon they're trying to do the same with the entirety of COVID-19. We'll talk a little bit more about the origin bit later, but first let's talk about the death. Now, with how many people have died in China from COVID-19, the mystery is still there, and it's unanswered by the Communist Party. According to the Wall Street Journal, official reports on the number of bodies cremated, which is normally released quarterly, disappeared or haven't been updated on schedule in more than 30 provinces, cities, or districts. One city even erased records going back to the beginning of 2020. Now, if you have nothing to hide, why are you deleting everything? And of course, there is various circumstantial evidence pointing to a dramatic decline in the Chinese population since 2020, and that again has to do with the virus. Now, the most recent one is actually India, which is likely becoming the largest population in the world, surpassing China. Meanwhile, population experts estimate China's current population is much lower than that 1.4 billion they have so claimed, even though they did say that for the first time in a very long time, China's population is in decline. In my view, a decline of something like 400 million in population is close to the real number. Here's why. The amount of unaccounted death from zero COVID, which is China's draconian measures of lockdowns, testing, and just basically covering up how many people actually died, over the past 3 years, it's actually, to this day, somehow still claiming that only 5,200 people died. Now, that number is directly a result of COVID. Overall, the number of deaths is something like the 80,000 when we account all of the circumstantial death that has resulted from related to COVID. But that's, again, a very undercounted number, given the fact that at a standard 1% case fatality, which is a positive case that has resulted in a death, 1% is pretty low around the world, China would still be upward of something like 10 million deaths. And that's, again, on the very low end, given the lack of cremation data. But from the videos we've seen and the multiple cities going on rounds of lockdowns, we know the actual number of deaths is far greater than just a few million. Now, we know that by any means of models, studies, deductions, or even just common sense, like we've been doing, would say that the real death number is probably in the hundreds of millions. And China has basically done the same with its COVID research data. When we try to talk about the origin of COVID, at the very onset of Wuhan's outbreak, some of the research registries and lab data were actually deleted to cover up the origin of COVID. In the early days of the Wuhan outbreak, what happened was the Chinese military officers took control and went in and started to delete everything that was critical to uncovering where the virus came from. Things like gene sequencing, DNA samples, you had lab records and data showing exactly what took place leading up to the outbreak. All of that's gone. And this is all because China doesn't want us to remember what caused the virus. Now, most of the research data, you can't get it from China, and the ones that they kept basically pointed to the other direction. Having done all the cleanups, it's now time to change history. Instead of the millions of deaths, China won't speak about it. They focus on how great the leadership process was to defeat COVID. Now, as we know, the draconian lockdown method, it's called zero COVID, which is really just about a number. It's literally about keeping the number zero, right? It doesn't care about human suffering. It doesn't care about human lives. It doesn't care much about humanity. And it's not rational either. Before November 2022, the central government remained consistent with the cruel method of locking down an entire city months on end once a few cases were discovered. The white overalls, the testing stations, the COVID app, the arrest, and busing people to quarantine camps, all of that is being written now as a proper stepping stone to the victory of defeating COVID. And according to the Wall Street Journal, authorities have been censoring discussions on social media that dwell on the long-term psychological toll on the government's zero COVID policy, which we all understand, again, specifically towards kids, being locked inside their homes for days on end was pretty damaging to their mental and psychological abilities, as well as just growth in general. But that is long not talked about when it comes to what has happened to adults. There were many cases of suicide in China because they were locked inside for days on end. Now, this is a psychologically damaging action by China, and it has actually been largely ignored by the government. So, until Beijing abruptly abandoned the rules late last year, which is after the November protest, this is all now being justified as a stepping stone towards the success, right? That sudden shift to abandon zero COVID is also an example of how the CCP views people. One moment, they all say you must be locked inside. The next moment, they're saying you have to go outside and you have to do all these things. People in China are just seen as an expendable resource. They can be sacrificed for a government and basically for the government to achieve anything. People refer to themselves in China as chives. Basically, they're easy to grow, easy to cultivate, but easy to be cut by the sickles of communism. In recent weeks, authorities have been shutting down the remembrance of the first anniversary of the months-long lockdowns in Shanghai. Well, that was a period that left many people scarred. And there was also these other commemorations being carried out in different meanings to, again, basically try to remember the shocking history. Well, China decided it's time to erase all of that. They don't want people to remember what happened around these brutal times. They're rewriting COVID history for the precise action so that people don't remember, right? Remembrance to most people is the idea that they can cherish what was done before to learn from the historical lessons so things never be done again in that same way, right? The Holocaust, we learn, we study, and we read about it because we know that it was a crime against humanity. It should never happen again. But China doesn't want you to do that. It doesn't want you to remember. And in some cases, they don't even want you to learn about it in the first place. Now, the government will set a new rule against anyone who dares to bring up what happened since 2020. And now, of course, once we know that the official tone against zero COVID has been set, where it is government winning and government doing the most to help the people, now they will enforce measures to anyone that dares to challenge the narrative. And again, these people will be punished. So it's a crime to challenge the regime now. And they will extend into businesses and local governments. So in those cases, if their financial reports read anything pinning the blame of financial losses or negative costs onto zero COVID, well, they'll also be punished. So they have to pin it on some sort of an anti-communist force, whatever that force may be. So just like how the Communist Party redefined the students of Tiananmen Square protest in 1989 as these, we know that they were democracy-seeking students asking the government to change, but they were called anti-revolutionaries. They were called disruptors, right? Much like the Cultural Revolution, these people were demonized. And so that the anti-protests killing the students, they were actually able to roll the tanks over them. All of these were justified as stabilizing the country. With events like Tiananmen, the party takes a step further too, right? Like I just talked about, they try to erase it from the textbooks so that many in China don't ever hear about it. Younger generation know very little about the various political campaigns and movements, especially Tiananmen Square massacre. These things in their brain non-existent. So much of China today don't really know what took place in Tibet, in Xinjiang, or what happened to hundreds of thousands of Falun Gong practitioners jailed, persecuted for their faith. Because each time it is the leadership in Beijing that made the absolute right call, at least on paper, so that it was their right call at the right time that created this victorious situation. a classic, as I would say. Basically, just kind of like how Mao Zedong, even though he killed millions and hundreds of millions of people, he always somehow made the right calls and justifies that he basically murdered millions for the sake of the party, right? It's to roll tanks into Beijing, to lock down cities, to rob all these people of money, whatever it is, at the end of the day, the benefit for the Communist Party outweighs the cost of human lives. And then again, to the Communist Party, that's the right call. Now, Beijing has continued to promote the idea that decisions were recognized by the people. Now, somehow that the people had a say in all of this, how this all went down. How the 3 years of zero COVID was for the people, and the people asked for it, and the people agreed to be locked down for 3 years. In reality, we all know that nothing was actually being discussed among the people, and in some instances, it is actually reality bending. Now, one of the articles claim in China right now that it has prepared enough medical resources for the latest outbreak before January of this year, but in reality, many in China were complaining about the lack of basic fever medicines like Tylenol. So the official narratives will always ignore what's actually happening to the people, but they will still claim that the people agreed with them. So we also have other strong themes in Chinese state media, things like economic recovery and social stability, which of course is an attempt to boost the domestic confidence that the same things won't happen ever again. Zero COVID is gone for good. We've defeated the virus. You guys can be confident in the party that we're here for the people, to serve the people. So it's very quite interesting, right? Overall, we can view China's zero COVID as a political campaign to basically persecute anyone in China. But we know that since 1949, when the CCP took power, there's been major political campaigns or political movements almost every decade that resulted in the death of hundreds of millions, right? Many of them actually were because the results of for the people. The Communist Party, however, has rewritten each one of them as a positive factor in helping the party develop itself. And again, it's all for the people. So it's a pretty funny saying that Chinese people always say. It's that the CCP keeps winning. They won again, or they're just nonstop winning. They can't win hard enough. It's because the fact that the reality is no matter what, it seems the CCP is always winning, despite of the millions of deaths in the end. And people are just basically cannon fodders for their victory. I mean, a few 100 million deaths by the CCP is just a number. To them, it doesn't actually mean much. After all, just force people to have more kids if the population declines, right? One Chinese economist in recent days actually calls kids, quote, durable consumer products. In other words, having kids in China today is like livestock having offsprings, just breeding slaughterhouse animals, it seems. It's no wonder that the CCP can enjoy one political movement after another. They're just using human lives as a forever fuel for the regime's stability. And the words of this economist, who is considered a pretty influential scholar in the Communist Party, is actually speaking the minds for the general understanding at the top level. Basically, using expendable human lives as a resource, and that's perfectly fine. Her comments actually sparked a massive wave of public opinion outburst in China, but it does point to a pretty clear reality, because it's already too late. The people now realize that they're actually being used as expendable resources, and they've long been used prior to that too. But it's just that prior to the pandemic, such a large scale, actually before it was brought to the surface, most people, they all thought that it was only happening to one group of people. For so long, what happened to one particular group, say the bourgeoisies or landowners in China, was that they were exploiting the peasant class. It had nothing to do with the rest of us. And then it was saying that students at Tiananmen Square, they were branded as a group of traitors. They wanted change, exploiting the system of China. That had nothing to do with the rest of us. And then it was Falun Gong, Uyghurs, Christians, or Tibetans, the religious believers, they're threatening the rules. That had nothing to do with us. Eventually, those that served as a warning to the rest of the population that the CCP will come for you, finally experienced, almost everybody in China experienced that same thing, which is that people finally felt like the regime has now persecuted every single one of them. So people woke up and said, wow, all these group of people before us actually had everything to do with us, that we were next. Well, it's the same formula used throughout history, right? And we've seen this with every regime that has killed people. And now I just hope that people in China are finally awake to the disaster and try to stop the chaos. All right, that's it. The topic today is how China is trying to rewrite the history of zero COVID and COVID in general. And I hope you enjoy the content. If you do, please subscribe to our channel and like this video so that more people can watch the video. And also make sure to comment below what your thoughts are on China doing this. All right, I'm David Zhang. This is China Insider. We'll see you next time.